Hello and welcome to Prairie Pulse. Coming up a little bit later in the show, we'll learn about prairie chickens in our region. But first, joining me now is the Director of Museum Operations from the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, Emily Colzert. Emily, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you for having me on.
As we get started, tell the folks a little bit about yourself and maybe where you're originally from and your background.
All right, so I grew up outside of a tiny town in northern Minnesota called Bijou. It's about 8 miles north of Mahnomen. I've always loved history, and when it came time to go to college, I enrolled in NDSU's public history program. So I graduated from the program in 2007 with a Bachelor of Science in Public History and a minor in Apparel Studies.
Okay. As we're here to talk a little bit about women's suffrage. But before we do that, tell me just a little bit about the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County. Tell me a little bit about it and what its mission is.
So our mission is to preserve the history of Clay County, also to interpret that history. So we are primarily a collecting institution, but we do also have exhibits on Clay County history. We get a lot of traveling exhibits that we try to supplement with local history as well. And then we also do a lot of historical lectures and events.
Oh, good. Well, there we go. And here today we want to talk about women's suffrage, the 100th anniversary, and how your organization is sort of marking this occasion. Can you talk about some of the events and things you have planned?
Yeah, so we don't really have anything nailed down for 2020 yet. But our next 2019 event is going to be on December 1st. We're teaming up with the League of Women Voters of the Red River Valley and Bonanzaville, and they're going to be hosting a celebration at Bonanzaville for the North Dakota ratification of the 19th Amendment. So it would be 100 years since North Dakota ratified on December 1st, and they have a dinner planned with a live band, and so that's going to be our next event. But for 2020, having the actual centenary of the 19th Amendment being nationally passed, we want to have programs on modern suffrage issues and voter registration on how to vote, because it's an election year next year too. Mm-hmm. So we really want to focus on not just the historical aspects of the anniversary, but the continued struggle that many people have with suffrage today.
Yeah, when you talked about North Dakota, when did Minnesota ratify the 19th Amendment?
So Minnesota just had their anniversary on September 8th. So September 8th, 1919 was when Minnesota ratified the amendment. But that didn't mean that all women had the right to vote on that day. About 25% of all African American women could vote at that time in the United States, and the other 75% were left disenfranchised, especially women who lived south of the Mason-Dixon line. So they faced poll taxes and violence when they were attempting to get to the polls. So they couldn't really vote, only in name that they could. And like African Americans, Native American women were also not granted the right to vote, many until 1924 when the Indian Citizenship Act was signed. But in many states like Arizona and New Mexico, indigenous people couldn't vote even until 1957.
Mm. Well, can you tell us about some of the important women in the area who sort of spearheaded women's suffrage protests?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say that Fargo-Moorhead women were at the same level as like the National Women's Party. They weren't a militant group by any means. We don't really have any evidence of them being as civilly disobedient as some of those groups, but they fought for suffrage in a different way. They fought for suffrage by being community leaders, being educated. They had support of their husbands, which was kind of unique. And then many women were members of the Moorhead Women's Club and the Literary League of Barnesville. So Mary Oliver was one of the founding people of the Literary League. She was a chairwoman for the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. And then Clara Dillon Darrow, who was the wife of E.M. Darrow, who was a prominent doctor in the area. She was the founder and the first president of the Fargo Votes for Women League. And she is also the mother of two of North Dakota's most prominent suffragists, Mary Darrow Weibel and Elizabeth Darrow O'Neill.
Yeah. Well, can you share maybe some interesting stories that you've uncovered during doing some of the research for this?
Yeah, so Helen DeLandresi was also a suffragist from Fargo. The DeLandresi building in Fargo is actually named for her husband. So she was actually an actress and a burlesque dancer before she moved up to Fargo. So she has a pretty interesting past. And then one of my personal favorite stories is of Anna Gates. She was another local chairwoman of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. And she was a Norwegian-born immigrant who married a letter carrier from Moorhead. And she actually went on to become Moorhead's first policewoman. So as the police matron of Moorhead, she went on to work with women and children offenders. So not only was she a cop, but she was also a social worker, and she headed many charity drives that helped to feed and clothe the poor people of Moorhead all through the Great Depression. But she, like many of the women in our area, she focused her energy on North Dakota suffrage groups because most of the action in Minnesota was in St. Paul, and for Fargo, or for North Dakota, it was in Fargo. So it was a little bit easier for these women to just head over to the other side of the river than go all the way down to St. Paul.
With that said, can you tell us about, you said a lot more activity going on down there. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so the energy of Minnesota's suffrage movement was really focused in St. Paul, whereas in Moorhead, like I said, the women collaborated with their allies on the other side of the river. Those who were active in the suffrage movement were mostly the social elite, and Minnesota's social elite lived in St. Paul, not in Moorhead. Of course, there's a few exceptions to that. Of course, Solomon Comstock and his wife Sarah Comstock were Moorhead's elite, and they did a lot for suffrage here. But you'll find families of prominent bankers, lawyers, doctors, and state legislators on the roster of Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association in St. Paul.
Mm-hmm. Well, I understand you participated in a recent parade in Moorhead. What was that about?
Yeah, so we teamed up with the League of Women Voters of the Red River Valley to march in the Greater Moorhead Days Parade. On September 6th, we donned our Votes for Women sashes and marched to spread the word about the September 8th centenary and the other events that we're going to be planning as well.
Yeah, well, with that event you recently held at the Comstock House, you mentioned Comstock, and tell us about that.
Yeah, so we had, it was a great afternoon for an event. Again, we worked with the League, and we celebrated that centenary on September 8th. We celebrated with pie from the Sons of Norway. Former Minnesota State Representative Diane Ray Williams gave a very inspiring keynote address about how far women have come in the past 100 years and the work that still needs to be done. And then we also invited elected women officials from Fargo and Moorhead and Cass and Clay County to come and be recognized at the event.
Sure. Well, you talk about an exhibit, I think, that will be open in the fall of 2020. What will the exhibit look like? What's it going to feature?
So the exhibit is titled A Century of Civic Engagement, League of Women Voters, Minnesota. So this is a traveling exhibit that was created by the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. So they used their network of local League chapters to kind of get a collective history of what the suffrage movement has looked like throughout the 100 years in Minnesota. But we will also be supplementing that exhibit with our own local history. So the women that I talked about earlier, so Clara Dillon Darrow, Anna Gates, we're also going to be featuring those women in the exhibit.
Yeah. Well, what goes into creating or getting an exhibit like this and getting it set up?
So since this is a traveling exhibit, a lot of the legwork had already kind of been done for us. So the league did a lot of the research and the editing and the design and the curation of the exhibit. So the main frame of the exhibit is already done for us. So we just had to sign up to be on the list to receive that exhibition. It's on tour already throughout the state of Minnesota. And through 2020, it will be on display. But we've been doing a lot of research on our own. Marcus Krieger, my colleague, has been doing a spectacular job of researching these local women. So we're excited to be able to showcase them in the exhibit.
Well, it will be interesting. But think about it, take us back 100 years, and how long had it been where women were demanding the right to vote in this country before it finally came about?
Well, really, women had been demanding the vote before the country even started, but it wasn't until the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848 that was really the start of what we think of as the suffrage movement today. Women had been meeting before then to talk about women's rights, but it wasn't until later that suffragists looked back and saw that that was really the start of the movement.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, how hard was it? I mean, police, I'm sure, intervened in some of the protests. Talk about some of that, please.
Yeah, so getting the men in Congress to listen to them was probably one of the biggest challenges. At the time, men believed that women's place was in the home. So if women were out being politically active, who was going to stay home and cook and clean and raise the children? So just trying to get the men's attention was one of their goals. And in those efforts, sometimes the police would get involved, especially with the more militant suffrage groups like the National Women's Party. They were headed by Alice Paul. They did a lot of things like aggressive agitation and did some clever publicity stunts to get the attention of lawmakers. And a lot of women were arrested in 1917 and 1918 because they were picketing the White House in a time of war. And many people thought that as an act of treason to picket or criticize a president in wartime. So they would be arrested and placed in prison. And then a lot of the women would go on hunger strikes and eventually be force-fed, which was a PR nightmare for a lot of lawmakers. That's not something that they wanted in the headlines. So people were outraged when they learned what these women were going through in jail, and that helped get the attention of Washington.
Yeah, and obviously this took a long time. So why did it take so long?
So it's a difficult question. I think most people think it took so long because of like the sexism involved, and that women had a hard time convincing men that they were equal. But by 1919, suffragists had really kind of been pretty successful beating down that ideal that women weren't equal to men. And it was less of sexism, but more racism that was really the cause for the long delay. So I had mentioned that African American women didn't really have the right to vote even after the 19th Amendment passed. And it was these Southern Democrats that were really afraid that if these African American women won the vote, it would restart the Civil War. And they thought that racial solidarity between these groups of women would be advantageous to the Republican Party. And it wasn't until the Republican Party gained the majority in 1919 that the 19th Amendment was actually ratified. So the Southern Democrats were right that letting these women votes would be advantageous to their opposing party.
Okay. Is it hard for someone like you and realize that 100 years ago, not that many generations Of course, women couldn't vote in this country. Something now you probably take for granted.
I would say that being a historian, I don't take it for granted just because I've read so many of the struggles that women had been through. And it's not really hard for me to realize that it was only 100 years ago. People think that 100 years ago was a really long time ago. But in fact, my own grandmother was 7 years old when her mother gained the right to vote. So personally, I don't take my right to vote for granted. I vote in every election that I can. And I vote because there are still people in this country that don't have that right.
Okay. Well, can you talk a bit about why some states, ratified the 19th Amendment quicker than others?
Yeah, that goes back to that racism, question. If you look at a map that shows when each state ratified, you'll see a lot of states in the South didn't grant women any type of suffrage. There were a lot of states in the North that granted women presidential suffrage, but no other types of suffrage, so they weren't able to vote in municipal elections or school board elections, just presidential elections. And I also think that has to do with the role of women. So in Wyoming and other western states, Wyoming was one of the first states to grant women full suffrage, and I think that was because it was a pioneer state. So women were really out in the fields, right next to their husbands and their sons, working the land. So not only were they out doing the physical labor, but they were also bearing and raising children. So I think that the men really took that step to kind of salute their hardworking women.
What do you hope people get out of the events you're going to do over the next year, and what kind of understanding will they get?
I hope that people will no longer take their voting rights for granted. I hope that the events will inspire them to get involved in the political process and inspire them to become informed voters. I know a lot of people think that politics isn't important, but politics runs through every facet of your life, whether you think so or not. So I think having that power to vote and have a voice is really important.
Well, and you mentioned your voting. What's your message, especially to women who maybe don't vote or haven't voted in a while?
Mm-hmm. I would just ask them to think about their grandmothers and their great-grandmothers. This was a right at that one point they didn't have. At one point, they were thought of as less than male citizens. And then they were not allowed to participate in the activity that really defines democracy. And in the last election, I told my mom and sisters that they better be voting because it wasn't even 100 years ago that we women didn't have a chance to use our voices.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're about out of time, so if people want more information about women's suffrage events, and where can they go? Who can they contact?
Yeah, so they can take a look at the websites and Facebook pages of the Historical and Cultural Society of Clay County, the League of Women Voters of the Red River Valley, and of Bonanzaville. So stay tuned.
All right. Emily, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Stay tuned for more. The Blue Stem Prairie Grasslands in Glendon, Minnesota is where you can find a ritual that's been going on for as long as prairie chickens have been around. Male chickens gather every year to attract females. Here's a look at the importance of grassland conservation to keep this endangered bird from disappearing.
My name is Brian Winter, and I'm responsible for protecting and managing grasslands that contain the remnant population of prairie chickens that Minnesota has. And so it was a natural progression for me to get involved with the Minnesota Prairie Chicken Society, and eventually I became, president of the organization. A prairie chicken is a bird in the grouse family that's roughly the size of even a barnyard chicken, a lot of people might be familiar with, or a mallard duck, or even a little smaller than a pheasant. They are very heavily barred with their feathers in terms of both males and females. They look alike if you just see them sitting in the grass with really great camouflage, tans and browns and white colorations that blend into the brown grass quite well. But what really makes prairie chickens unique, I think, and make them kind of a humorous bird actually, is their display. When they gather in the spring on these booming grounds, the males have large, almost look like oranges that are attached to the side of their neck, and they inflate those. They have what look like rabbit ears, but scientifically they're called pinnae, and they're two large, distinct feathers that they erect above their head that look like rabbit ears. They drop their wings down, they fan their tail, they stomp their feet, and then they run around doing this crazy display, fighting with each other, trying to get the attention of females for the right to mate. And so they're a very colorful bird, particularly in the spring when the males are doing their best to attract a female to pass on the genes. When they're inflating those orange air sacs I talked about previously on the side of their neck, there's actually passing of the air that creates this, some people describe it like if you were to take an empty pop bottle and blow over the top, you get that kind of woo call. That's considered that's the booming sound they make. And that sound, amazingly, will carry for several miles. I do the survey for prairie chickens in the county, and I'll hear them sometimes, and then you need to try to find them and count them, and you'll think, oh, they're not too far over. I'll just take a little walk over there, and you keep going and going and going, and they wind up 1.5 miles from your vehicle because the sound carries so well. But besides that booming call that they make, they have a cackle call, which is they're just sitting there on the booming ground, just kind of repeatedly, I'm not even going to try to make it, but making this cackling sound. Within a booming ground, each male defends and they fight for the right to establish territory within the broader booming ground. So the big area is the booming ground, but then you need to think of it like a jigsaw puzzle. There's these odd-shaped pieces that belong to each male individually, and they fight. The bigger the piece of the booming ground you have, the more likely a female that comes to the booming ground will be on your territory and give you the right to mate with her if she so chooses you. And it's kind of unique in that the biggest, most dominant males, the male prairie chickens, wind up in the middle of the booming ground with the smallest territory because they have to defend it from all sides. There's a lot of prairie chickens trying to get to the middle, and research has shown that over 80% of the breeding of prairie chickens occurs in that middle zone. And then they have a whooping call, which usually is reserved for when there are actually females on the ground. So the males spend a lot of time on a booming ground by themselves. There's no females there. And they display and fight and do things that males do. But when the females show up, then they kind of whoop, 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 whoop. I think it's more of a cat call, if you will, to the female to, come over here, come to my little piece of this booming ground and, see if you like me. The people that use the blind are from all over the country and really other countries we've had in the prairie chicken blinds. And they're usually full from the 1st of April to the middle of May, which is kind of the time frame that we typically reserve the blind because that's the best time frame to ensure that you're going to see a really active display from the males. Well, I think that what the average person can do is to, one, learn more about prairie chickens and grasslands and learn what's happened, learn that history, some of which we've talked about here. But my sort of hidden agenda, I guess I would say, is that if you appreciate prairie chickens, you have to appreciate grass and grassland habitat and thereby grassland conservation, because you cannot have prairie chickens if you don't have large blocks of grassland habitat. And so I think if people have really positive experiences and are appalled, as I am, with the thought that we may not have prairie chickens someday, that they should provide assistance through legislative efforts, through funding, through support in the community, that these grassland preserves, these grassland nature preserves do provide a tremendous benefit. when I sit in the blind, it's amazing to me to have this primeval ceremony where these prairie chickens are gathering on this booming ground, and off at the distance, only 15 miles away, you see all the lights of Fargo-Moorhead. So you have all that civilization in the background as you're looking out the blind with these birds doing this display that they've done for thousands of years, literally tens of thousands of years, right here on the Nature Conservancy's Bluestem Prairie. And so if people want that display and those booming grounds to carry on, it's going to take support for grassland conservation. That's, I think one of the key things that is positive for the future of prairie chickens.
Well, that's all we have on Prairie Pulse this week. And as always, thanks for watching.
Funded by the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund with money from the vote of the people of Minnesota on November 4, 2008. And by the members of Prairie Public.